All right, so in this module, we're going to be looking at languages. It's important to acknowledge that this year, 2019, is the International Year of the World's Indigenous Languages. And that, in part, tells us something about the significance of language to Indigenous identities, not just here in Australia, but elsewhere. And what we see very strongly is moves to revitalise. So last week we looked at art, and this week we're going to expand on our notion of language, but then also look at some of the ways in which Western knowledge has been used to try and make Indigenous languages, well, one, not practiced, working on this idea of, giving up language for your own good. If you want to advance, and that's definitely in inverted commas, you'll be prepared to take on the language of the West, which is the language of commerce and the language of, the predominant education system. Because we know that language isn't just about communicating. It's also about the way in which cultures are enacted. So it's this essential character. And if we take away Indigenous languages, then we actually impact, in a ripple effect on so many elements of culture. Okay? It's quite amazing when we look at the colonial records, which say that Aboriginal languages were simplistic, when in fact, they, and I mean, this is an unfortunate comparison that we have to do comparisons, but Aboriginal languages tend to have as many words as other languages. But what we might find is that there'll be a number of words, for instance, for something in the environment to explain weather patterns or slight seasonal change. Okay, whereas, we might find that, level of complexity and diversity in Western languages on other topics entirely. And so we need to think, well, one language is not better than another. But one of the predominant ways that European languages have been seen to be superior to Indigenous languages is through numbers. So there is this idea that Aboriginal languages didn't have any numbers, above about 4 or 5, and they just saw lots or many. And while this has been disproved many times, there are a lot of people who still see this as a truism. We can also see that language is really important in kinship. And one of the things that it's significant to understand about the kinship process is that it's highly structured, but it's also quite mathematical in the way that it's worked out. So, the classificatory terms in Aboriginal languages in kinship are much more complex than they are then, say, in English. Okay, so we've got a link here to an ABC piece of footage, which is on, the different stages of a woman's life, so it's not just childhood, teenager, adults, middle age, old age. It's far more complex than that. And I think it's a really interesting watch. Okay, so we can also see that Aboriginal languages don't use the same sounds as English. And one of the things I think that this has meant over time is that some of the records of Aboriginal languages, particularly by colonists, but even by, some of the early linguists, have really failed to comprehend that. But it also means that Aboriginal children who speak their languages come to school with a different set of language sounds, particularly in that young period of life. Okay, so, there may be similarities in sounds. So we're saying things like, a P and a B, a B and a P. Okay, these are actually quite similar in where they're made in the mouth. but it's your familiarity with the way that they're used in different languages that helps you be able to distinguish between those. So what we do see in the literature and also in, say, a lot of school practice is an idea about Aboriginal English, which is in many ways similar to Australian English, but does actually have some differences in its grammar, in its lexicon, so the words, that are said in that and the meanings. So, we do need to be aware that Aboriginal patterns of speech are not bad English, but rather a different type of English, okay? And we see that as well then, with other types like Creoles, okay? So it's important to understand, this is a dialect, not a failure to grasp standard English. So one of the concepts that is continuously raised in Indigenous studies is the idea of decolonization. Okay, so we can see that during the colonial practice, that language is one of the things which gets attacked most strongly. So decolonization then, in practice, will allow us to revitalise and, re-empower Aboriginal languages. And while this certainly doesn't overturn the colonial history or the colonial legacy, what it allows for is futures that will return some of the power, return that self-determining aspect. Do I want to speak my own language? Yes, I do. When we look at different resources that are prepared in terms of language, we need to think about things like who wrote it, what was their cultural lens, why was it written and who was going to read it, who benefits, what's the context, and what are the holistic range of issues that impact on why and how it was written. Now, one of the key institutions in Australia that considers those kinds of questions is the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, AATSIS. Okay, so it holds a whole range of recordings, whether that's audio recordings or textual recordings on language. And one of the things which they're doing really strongly through their national language collections is attempting to try and repatriate a lot of that information back to communities. Okay, so they have over 4,000 files. And as it says here, it's of such significance that it's been placed on the UN register. So what happens in this process is that, sometimes that repatriation, simply goes to another institution. So, for instance, to the State Library. So the State Library of New South Wales already has its own collections. So it has over 200 language lists of Indigenous Australian languages. Okay, and they've tried to do different things to bring community in and rediscover those languages. So a good example was the 2017 activity where they invited people into a transcribe-a-thon. So let's listen to these languages and let's get these down, because once they're down like that, they can be returned to communities, used in schools with proper community consultation, used by local councils. There's a whole range of usages that can happen. Something that is relatively recent is the, if you like, and I hesitate in some ways to use this word, but the discovery that Indigenous languages that were spoken at the time of colonisation actually come from one common ancestor language. okay, which was in the Northern Territory, and they're unsure, how that filtered across the continent, but they believe that they can prove that it did. There's a whole range of Indigenous language programs in Australian schools. I'm putting up a link with this lecture for you to look at the Wiradjuri Language Revitalisation Program, which is happening in Western New South Wales. And this is, for many Aboriginal people, a really exciting development. And we can see ways too that Aboriginal languages have been written into the Australian curriculum. Okay, so we've got some links here to the New South Wales Board of Studies, which is the governing body for curriculum in New South Wales schools. Okay, and so, the kindergarten to year 10 and also a year 12 program. Okay, so in New South Wales, we have seen the implementation of language programs. So we've got an example here that in 2016 there was a Barkindji language class in Menindee Central School. But, if any of you have had the opportunity to attend NAIDOC celebrations, last year or this year, in this week, you will quite probably have seen people using language. All right. Another example is St John's Park High School in New South Wales, where they're trying to implement languages. Now, one of the things that we find, when we start looking at these holistic effects, is that it makes a huge difference to students in terms of things like attendance, in terms of well-being. And we've also seen the development of a range of organisations that support this. So an organisation which is in Newcastle is Miramar. And I'd really encourage you to look at their website. If you would like to go down the languages path, these guys have a lot of resources that can help you. So particularly useful for teachers, but I think also for people who are just interested in languages generally. So it is a not-for-profit, and it does use technology. So we're seeing some really interesting and innovative ways in which technology is helping us to revitalise and reclaim languages.